Hello everyone, my name is Disal Sandoval, and today for my visual audio presentation, I'm going to be talking about the topic, how society's definition of masculinity and femininity affects gender identity. So I would like to begin with a little interview that I did with my family, and the questions are, how does society affect gender identity, how does family affect gender identity, and how does one know their gender identity? Okay, Billy, I have a series of questions for you today. You're going to be answering these questions with your own opinion. Remember, there are no right or wrong answers. Okay, so the first question will be, how does society affect gender identity?
Society plays a large role in gender identity because we have basically formed our world around gender. So the products that we sell, it's always comes in men's razor and women's razor. And immediately when you enter a store, you're bombarded with a men's section and a women's section. I think the fact that society sort of like put it in the front of like everything we do, I think that affects gender identity in a strong way because you can't really ignore it.
Now, how does family affect gender identity?
Yeah, so family plays a large role in anyone's upbringing, but because family is the people a child is surrounded with, right, throughout their youth, and a person's youth plays a large role in the person they become. So if a child is like raised by parents who conform to like typical gender roles, that identify with that gender. So from my personal experiences, when I was growing up, my mom really forced like me to comply with what she believed a gender, like a girl was. So I'd have to wear skirts, I'd have to wear dresses, I wasn't really allowed to play with boys' toys. And I think that whole experience really affected my gender identity. And I could see others, they take a different route and perhaps don't identify as a woman later.
For the last question, it's going to be, how does one know their gender identity?
I think a person knows what their gender identity is by feeling comfortable in what they are. Honestly, some people don't know until they're in their 30s. Like, it takes, everyone's different, and some people are still discovering what their gender is. But yeah, it's a whole experience.
So I also interviewed my older brother, but for the sake of time, I cut it out. But to summarize, his view of these questions, it was more straightforward. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting to see the two and their dynamic perceptions. So, gender refers to the socially constructed roles and behavior that are considered normal in a society. It has more to do with a person's thought, actions, and self-awareness rather than physical appearance. So gender tends to be more psychological, the interplay among our biological disposition of our development, experiences, and experiment or culture. And in contrast to sex, which refers to biological influence characteristics by which people determine males and females. So this is more the physical aspect. So, like the Y chromosomes, and then how Y chromosomes causes the gonads to release the male testosterones around the 7th week of conception, and how the extra testosterones create male sex organs, and yeah, so more physical than psychological. And then gender identity, which is a person's sense of being male, female, or a combination of the two. And one's gender identity is usually influenced by the biological and societal factors, and typically matches a person's sex. So, a infographic that I think is really helpful is the genderbread person, which I love the name. And then here you can see how the different terms pertain to where it is usually located in a person. So the gender identity is in the head, so how you think about yourself, and then the gender expression are all around. So how you express yourself, the way you dress, stuff like that. An example of that would be Harry Styles and when he dresses in a skirt. And then biological sex, we already talked about that. And then sexual orientation, which is your emotional or spiritual attraction towards a sex in relation to your own. So you could be heterosexual or homosexual or in between, bisexual. And then we have the gender roles and stereotypes. So it's the cultural expectations imposed on men and women to behave in ways deemed appropriate for their gender. And we'll be talking about how that can affect gender identity. So societal female stereotypes are home-oriented, nurturing, submissive, indecisive, dependent, cries a lot, etc. And you can see the pictures relating to the characteristics, as well as societal male stereotypes, which is being independent, dominant, decisive, tough, logical, and rarely cries. And men especially, gender roles are highly conflated with sexuality stereotypes. And there's been a research by a psychologist named Allen, which examined specific role of gay salients in heterosexual men's task experience of gender role. And basically what the results showed was reduced motivation for men when engaging in feminine framed tasks under gay salience conditions, whereas women were relatively unaffected by gender and sexuality manipulations. So these studies show how much gender roles can affect a man specifically psychologically when performing tasks under a female gender role, and this can ultimately affect one's gender identity. So now, gender stereotypes effects on gender identity. So gender stereotypes can heavily dictate a person's gender identity because during an individual's gender exploration, one can develop cognitive dissonance because their attitude and behavior may not coexist with the gender stereotypes that are associated with their biological sex. And then you can pause and read this example that I gave. So, society's effects on gender identity. So the effects on gender identity can be explained by the course of our history. In the 1800s and 1900s, society's perception on the sex was heavily correlated with their gender stereotypes. For example, a woman couldn't vote because in the American society, because girls were viewed as indecisive and too dependent on their husband's thoughts. So they weren't viewed as smart enough to think for themselves. This affected many gender's identities because there was no room for questioning their gender. Now, family's effects on gender identity. So basically, parents use punishment and reinforcements. And parents expect their sons to play tough on the athletic field and hold back tears when they're hurt or upset. On the other hand, girls are praised for cooperative play or helping in the kitchen, while punishing them if they conduct gender inappropriate behavior. These are effects families have towards the upbringing of one's gender identity. And my final thoughts are that society's definitions of masculinity and femininity is toxic because it leads to many people living a lie and a facade, because some people live their lives associated with the gender identity that is more accepted by either their family or society rather than their own. And that is mainly the reason why I chose this topic, is to really emphasize on the idea that you shouldn't live a life accordingly to society, not just speaking of gender, but in life in general. So yeah, that is just a message I wanted to give out through this presentation. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.